Okay, this is going to serve as your introduction to American-style federalism. This first set of notes is going to look at kind of constitutionally how the system is set up in terms of balancing power between the state government and the national government. And then in a second set of notes, we'll kind of look at how it's evolved over time. We know that there's been an issue of balance between state and federal power for a long period of time, right? Really since the end of the Declaration of Independence, there was a question of who should have the power to govern state governments versus the national government. And we've never really fully resolved that issue in terms of settling a balance. Yes, the Constitution has elements like the Supremacy Clause where the Constitution is always supreme, but then there are things like the 10th Amendment that try and check expansions of federal power beyond their constitutionally given duties. There's never really been a have your cake and eat it too kind of balance between these two where the states and the federal government have been happy with it. You should look at your notes about the Articles of Confederation. You'll see your explanation as to why we opted for a system of confederacy under that government in a time where we thought it was maybe a little bit more historically appropriate. But then we saw the repercussions of that kind of system when the national government was too weak and the states were way too strong. The Civil War is an example of the system of state versus federal power being out of check, because the moment the national government tries to take a stance on the issue of slavery, states immediately respond by trying to nullify those laws and strike them down, believing that they had the power to do so. When the national government responds by saying, you can't nullify federal law, the South secedes and we fight a civil war over slavery and really a question of what kind of government should be the most influential. In a world where the Civil War ends, right, it kind of solidifies the notion that the federal government is in charge. It solidifies that the federal government has the most power, but it doesn't really answer the question as to whether or not there's a balance or how that balance is struck. So in order to best kind of look at federalism as a system that strives for balance, we'll compare it between federal, confederate, and unitary systems of government. When we talk about federalism, here's your good kind of working definition: a system in which power is constitutionally divided between a central government and subnational governments. The most important part of this definition is the phrase constitutionally divided. When government has this power, right, it means there's a protection of what the national government can do in the Constitution, but there are also protections of states' rights, of what states can do, what kinds of power they should have. And we'll look at examples of this. But where federalism is notably different from something like a unitary system is the notion that the existence of state governments is something that's constitutionally protected. We're not the only federal system in the world. We're probably the leading model where people will look to the United States and try and adapt their system off of it. And if you take comparative government in the spring semester, we'll do things like compare the United States' federal system to that of Nigeria and Mexico and see how that's different from a form of asymmetric federalism used by the Russian Federation, or how it's different from a unitary system of government that shows up in the United Kingdom. Under an American style of federalism, both governments, meaning the state and the national government, receive power from the people, right? Both governments are semi-sovereign. Both of them have to have the support of the people to be able to exist. They divide sovereignty, and in the context of the United States Constitution, it comes thanks to something like the 10th Amendment that says anything that's not in the Constitution is reserved for the states. Both governments have the power to tax, both governments have the power to receive benefits, and neither government has the power to dissolve one another. And that'll be, again, important when we compare it to a unitary system in a moment. Federalism is probably the exact opposite of a confederal government or a confederate system of government, where it only has the powers, it being the central government, only has the powers given by its members. Think of the Articles of Confederation. Think of the Confederate States of America. These are governments that had a lack of central authority that runs into creating some kinds of problems if the central government needs to try and dissolve tensions between two of its members. Think about some of the problems that the United Nations or the European Union runs into when these central bodies are trying to do something that may conflict with some of the interests of its member states. So we opted out of a confederal system into a federal system. But the third kind of system of government that is, lingering around in the world today is a unitary system of government. Unitary systems have supreme central authority. So there is a strong national government, and the most strength and the most power rests with that national government. In a unitary system, it can create subnational governments, state governments, provincial governments, whatever, as is needed. The problem with a unitary system is there's no constitutional protection of power. In a world where there's no constitutional protection, the national government can give and take power away. It can create and destroy local governments. This is something that we see happen in the world of like the United Kingdom, where the United Kingdom's parliament can give and take authority away from some of the regional parliaments, like those of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. At the national government, or in the United States, we are mostly a federal system, but then at the level of the 50 individual states, we operate in a unitary fashion because each state government has the ability to alter or dissolve local governments, or they have the ability to give or take power away from those systems. So in a world where we opt to use a federal system of government, the Constitution has to do a couple of things to create legs for federalism to stand on. You'll see the list of 3 here, and we'll talk about them one by one. The first thing that the Constitution had to do was strengthen the power of the national government. And we can point to 2 clauses in the United States Constitution that do this. The Necessary and Proper Clause, which is also referred to as either the Implied Powers or the Elastic Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. You'll remember in our discussion of Brutus I, where he kind of lambasts how the Necessary and Proper Clause can be used to justify infinite power for Congress. Here's the language from Article 1, Section 8, and it's Clause 18, and the part I care about from this is the part that's in red, where it says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, which means they should have the power, additional power, to do anything they need to implement powers that show up before this in Article 1, Section 8. In a world where it's impossible to predict that the national government needs to do anything, something like the Elastic Clause exists to increase their power so they can implement their other powers. And this will be important in a moment where we look at a case that applies the Elastic Clause. If you want to in the notes, you can really listen to a very awkward cover of Lady Gaga's Applause that sings about the Elastic Clause. You can do that. The other clause that exists is the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution and laws in pursuance thereof are to be the supreme law of the land whenever they come into conflict with state laws or actions. So this means if the states pass a law that is contradictory to the Constitution, or Congress passes a law that is in contradiction with state law, that the national law will override the interest of the states. We'll apply these in a second, but we also need an understanding of the 10th Amendment. So when we strengthen the national government, we don't want to give them infinite power. We want to place limits on it as well. The 10th Amendment is the reserved powers section of the Constitution that essentially says anything that's not specifically given to Congress or given to the national government is a power of the states. Where we run into a question is whether or not the Necessary and Proper Clause and the 10th Amendment kind of cancel each other out, because the reserve power says if it's not in the Constitution, it's a state right, but The necessary and proper clause says if it's not in the Constitution and Congress needs that power, do they have the ability to do something? And the answer is yes. So it becomes a question as to whether or not these kind of cancel each other out. And where we'll look at these, two clauses in the 10th Amendment in action is looking at when they get applied to their first Supreme Court case. Here's an instance where I'll need you to use your graphic organizer on Supreme Court cases to fill it out over this case. The case that really becomes responsible for changing our understanding of federalism is the Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland essentially makes the decision that the implied powers given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 gives them a lot more power than the Constitution may have designed. The impact of this case ultimately is that the necessary and proper clause gives Congress the authority, or the federal government the authority, to do just about anything that they need. So here's your background information on McCulloch versus Maryland. It was decided in 1819. What happened is the federal government created a Bank of the United States, right? Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to do things like borrow and lend money, to create money, to keep supplies of money, things that a bank could do. So they created a bank to help them carry out some of their banking powers, and they established the Bank of the United States in Maryland. The state of Maryland was terrified of the Bank of the United States because they thought they could create unfair competition with state banks, that they could offer money at better rates, that people would want to deal with the national government bank because maybe it had a better financial guarantee than state banks, and it really started to threaten the profits or the ability of state banks to function. So Maryland responds by disproportionately taxing the existence of the national bank and the employees of the national bank. McCulloch, who is an employee of the Bank of the United States, refused to pay the state tax for working at the bank and opted to sue the state of Maryland. Whenever a case goes to the Supreme Court, they ask a couple of guiding questions that deal with the Constitution. So the first question that is asked by the Supreme Court, or the first issue they have to decide on, is the existence of the bank constitutional? They find the answer to this question is yes, because of the necessary and proper, or the elastic clause. They make the argument that since they have the power to do banking things in the Constitution, that creating a bank is a necessary bit of power, it's a necessary institution to implement the financial powers. So because the national government is delegated things like borrowing, lending, and holding minted money, creating a bank would do that. So because they could connect the dots to a different power in the Constitution, they assumed that the bank was constitutional. Banking shows up nowhere in the Constitution aside from some of these powers, but because there is this conflict, or because they have banking powers that are delegated in Article 1, they're given the power to do it. So the second question that they had to resolve was whether or not a state could tax the federal government. The answer to this is no, because of the supremacy clause. Because national laws and national institutions are supreme to that of state laws and state institutions, states can't tax the federal government. So Justice John Marshall, who was leading the Supreme Court at the time, reaffirms the supremacy clause and the elastic clause. And when we talk about federalism, you're going to hear me use the phrase balance a lot in the next set of notes. This kind of throws things a little out of balance because the federal government now gets stronger as a result of the decision in McCulloch versus Maryland, because the elastic clause can now be used to increase the type of power that the national government has, which would be in a direct trade-off with the reserved powers that are protected by the 10th Amendment. When we talk about comparisons to other cases that are both required and non-required, I'll kind of give you a list in a subsequent set of notes where we can kind of talk about the connection between McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, Lopez versus the United States or Reich versus Gonzalez. So this is your first set of notes. Complete your court case graphic organizer, and when you're ready, we'll talk about how federalism has kind of evolved through judicial decisions in the modern world.